The door to compartment 7 was not quite closed. That was the first thing Mrs. Adeline Marsh noticed. Not the stillness of the corridor, not the peculiar absence of sound from within, not even the sliver of yellow light that fell across the darkened passageway like a finger pointing at something shameful. It was simply that the door was not quite closed, and on the Caledonian Night Express from London's Euston Station to Edinburgh Waverley, the doors to the private sleeper compartments were always closed. The porters saw to it personally. It was a matter of professional pride. Mrs. Marsh was 53 years old, a widow of comfortable means and uncomfortable curiosity, and she had been making this particular journey twice yearly for 11 years. She knew the rhythm of this train the way she knew the rhythm of her own breathing. She pressed her lips together, adjusted the silk traveling robe about her shoulders, and paused in the corridor. It was 23 minutes past 2 in the morning. The express was somewhere north of Crewe, cutting through the English darkness at considerable speed, the countryside beyond the smoked windows an invisible, rushing blackness. The overhead corridor lights had been dimmed for the night, and the only sound was the steady, almost hypnotic percussion of wheels upon rails, that particular lullaby of long-distance travel that usually sent even the most anxious of passengers into insensibility. Mrs. Marsh had not slept. She never slept well on trains, despite what she told people. She had risen to find the attendant and request a second hot water bottle, as the one in her compartment had gone tepid, and she had found the attendant's station empty, his little folding chair unoccupied, a half-drunk cup of tea gone cold beside it. Rather than ring the bell and disturb the whole carriage, she had set off in the direction of the restaurant car on the slim and not unreasonable chance that someone might still be awake at the far end of the train. She had not expected to find compartment 7 ajar. She stood before it for what she afterwards calculated to be nearly a full minute. A more timid woman might have passed on. A more sensible woman certainly would have. But Adeline Marsh had once, during the war, driven an ambulance through Normandy under considerable fire, and she had never quite recovered the capacity for minding her own business that peacetime society required. She raised one knuckle and knocked, quietly, so as not to rouse the adjacent compartments. Nothing. She knocked again, slightly less quietly. Still nothing. But the door, under the pressure of her second knock, swung inward another inch, and with it came the smell. Not, as she would later clarify with some precision for the police, not a dramatic smell, not the smell of violence as she might have imagined it from detective novels. It was something subtler than that. Something medicinal and sweet and faintly wrong, like a sick room where the flowers had been left too long. "Hello?" she said, in the voice she used for people who had possibly fainted. Are you quite all right in there?" She pushed the door open. The compartment was arranged in its sleeping configuration, the upper bunk folded away and the lower berth extended, its bedclothes turned down with the neat, impersonal precision of professional hospitality. The small bedside lamp burned at its lowest setting, casting a warm, amber light over the scene that was almost gentle in its illumination, as though reluctant to show, too starkly, what it had to show. The man in the berth was lying on his back. He was dressed, which was the first incongruous detail, still in his evening clothes, the white shirt front unmarked, the black tie slightly loosened at the collar but otherwise perfectly arranged. His hands lay at his sides with a peculiar neatness, as though someone had positioned them. His eyes were closed. Had it not been for the color of his face and the stillness, that absolute, total stillness that is unlike any stillness produced by sleep, he might merely have been a man too tired to undress before lying down. But Mrs. Marsh had driven an ambulance through Normandy. She knew the difference. The man was Mr. Gerald Ashworth, 61 years of age, company director, member of the Institute of Directors, and, as those who moved in certain London financial circles were very well aware, the most ruthlessly effective negotiator in the steel industry. He had been, until approximately some hours ago, a man of considerable vitality, considerable wealth, and, as would shortly emerge, a quite considerable number of enemies. He was now emphatically dead. Mrs. Marsh did not scream. She considered it, in the detached and evaluative way she considered most things, and decided against it. Instead, she took one step backward into the corridor, pulled the compartment door to its former position, not quite closed, and stood for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the cool mahogany veneer paneling of the corridor wall, breathing with deliberate steadiness. Then she went to find someone in authority. What she did not notice, what no one would notice until much later, when it became the linchpin of everything, was the small, cut-glass tumbler on the fold-out shelf beside the berth. It sat there, quite empty, quite clean, catching the amber lamplight with an innocent sparkle. Around it, on the polished shelf surface, there was no ring, no residue, no suggestion that the glass had ever held anything at all. A man had drunk from a glass and died, and the glass was perfectly, impossibly clean. The Caledonian Night Express rushed onward through the dark, carrying its cargo of the sleeping, the wakeful, and the dead, and the miles between London and Edinburgh accumulated with majestic indifference to the small human catastrophe unfolding within its first-class sleeper carriage. In compartment 4, 3 doors down, a small, precise man with a remarkable moustache and an egg-shaped head was lying perfectly awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the rails, and thinking, as was his invariable habit in the dead hours of the night, about the curious inconsistencies of human behavior. He could not, of course, have known yet what had occurred in compartment 7. But Hercule Poirot had boarded this train with the vague, inexplicable unease of a man who senses that his well-ordered holiday is about to be interrupted. He had put it down, thus far, to the slightly inferior quality of the dinner served in the restaurant car, and the fact that the man at the adjacent table had used the wrong fork for his fish. He was, as it happened, wrong about the source of his unease. He was right, however, as he was almost always right, that something was very much amiss. The Caledonian Night Express carried, on this particular Thursday evening in the 3rd week of October, 14 passengers in its first-class sleeper carriage, a number that the conductor, Mr. Ronald Briggs, would later describe as comfortable, not full, not sparse, but the pleasant middle ground that allowed the staff to attend to everyone with appropriate attention while permitting the passengers themselves that degree of privacy which first-class travel was, above all else, designed to provide. Of those 14, 6 occupied the compartments immediately adjacent to or opposite compartment 7, and it was these 6, together with the dead man himself, who would shortly constitute what Inspector Glennie of the British Transport Police would refer to, with the blunt practicality of his profession, as the persons of interest. Poirot, privately, would refer to them as something rather more precise. A small society, artificially compressed, in which every courtesy was performance, every smile a negotiation, and every silence a declaration of something carefully unsaid. He would, in the fullness of time, be entirely correct. Miss Sylvia Cartwright occupied compartment 6, immediately to the left of the dead man's door. She was 28 and beautiful in the particular way that made people slightly uncomfortable, not because her beauty was excessive, but because it was so clearly, so consciously deployed. The cheekbones were always at their most advantageous angle when she entered a room. The pale gold hair was arranged with an artfulness that took considerable time to achieve and was designed to suggest it had taken none at all. She worked, she explained to anyone who asked, as a personal secretary, though she offered the information with a slight compression of the lips that suggested the word secretary was a costume she had not entirely chosen for herself. She had boarded the train at Euston with a single, expensive leather case and no companion, and she had dined alone in the restaurant car with the composed self-sufficiency of a woman accustomed to dining alone and not remotely reconciled to it. What she appeared to be, a self-possessed young professional traveling north on business. What she was actually feeling, a coiled, carefully managed anxiety that had been with her since she had seen, on the platform at Euston, who else was boarding this train. What she did not wish found. The letter. The letter she had written 6 weeks ago, and which she had every reason to believe was currently in the inside breast pocket of Mr. Gerald Ashworth's evening jacket. Colonel Bertram Fawkes, occupied compartment 8, immediately to the right of the dead man. He was 64, broad-shouldered and ruddy-faced in the manner of a man who had spent decades outdoors and was quietly proud of it. He had served in India, Malaya, and several locations he declined to specify, and he had the soldier's habit of assessing a room and every person in it within the first 30 seconds of entering. His handshake was too firm, his laugh was too immediate. His opinions arrived fully formed and untroubled by doubt. He had known Gerald Ashworth for 22 years, a fact he mentioned in the restaurant car with the expansive warmth of old friendship. He clapped Ashworth on the shoulder. He refilled Ashworth's wineglass without being asked. He told, at some length, a story about a shooting weekend in Perthshire in which Ashworth had featured as the punchline. Ashworth had laughed without his eyes, what the Colonel appeared to be. A bluff, uncomplicated old soldier, renewing an old acquaintance on a comfortable journey north. What he was actually feeling, the particular, grinding tension of a man who has rehearsed a conversation many times and has not yet found the courage to begin it. What he did not wish, found, the financial documents currently locked in the attaché case beneath his berth. Documents which bore both his signature and Ashworth's, and which represented, for Colonel Bertram Fawkes, the difference between a dignified retirement and a very public ruin. Mrs. Theodora Vane occupied compartment 5, one removed from the dead man, and she was by some distance the most immediately striking presence in the first-class carriage, despite being, or perhaps because of being, 67 years old. She was tall, angular, and dressed with an eccentricity so complete it had long ago crossed the border from fashion into personal mythology. She wore a traveling suit of deep plum, several ropes of amber beads of graduated size, and a hat of a style that had not been current since approximately 1934, and which she wore with the authority of someone who had personally decided that 1934 had been the pinnacle of millinery and saw no reason to revise this position. She was, as she announced to anyone within conversational range, a portrait painter of some reputation, traveling to Edinburgh for a commission. She had an opinion about everything, and expressed all of them with the serene confidence of a woman who had long since stopped caring whether she was agreed with. She had watched the other passengers in the restaurant car with the frank, unguarded attention of someone who has spent a lifetime studying faces professionally, and several of her observations had been, without her knowing it, extremely accurate. What she appeared to be: a magnificent, harmless eccentric. The sort of character who enriches a journey and is completely uninvolved in anything sinister. What she was actually feeling, a grief so old and so thoroughly managed that it had become simply the texture of her interior life. A grief connected, in ways that were not yet apparent, to Gerald Ashworth's name. What she did not wish, found. A photograph, kept in a small tortoiseshell case in her handbag, of a young man who had been dead for 31 years and who bore, around the eyes and the set of the jaw, a resemblance to Gerald Ashworth that was not coincidental. Mr. Frederick Lowe occupied compartment 9 and was the sort of man whom it was extremely easy to overlook. He was 35, of medium height, medium coloring, and medium build, and he wore the careful, self-effacing dress of a man who had learned at some point that invisibility was a professional asset. He was an accountant, he said, with a firm in Edinburgh. He was going home after a fortnight's work in the London offices. Yes, it had been productive. No, nothing of particular interest. He had a wife, Margaret, and 2 children, whose ages he produced with the automatic precision of a man who has answered this question many times and finds the answering of it oddly reassuring. He had not dined in the restaurant car. He had taken a sandwich in his compartment and had been observed by Mrs. Marsh in transit to the dining car, emerging into the corridor at approximately 10:30 with the expression of a man who has made a decision he is not certain was wise. What Mr. Lowe appeared to be: A forgettable, peripheral figure, a domestic background note in a scene populated by more vivid characters. What he was actually feeling, a terror so acute that he had, on 3 separate occasions during dinner hour, risen to go and speak to Ashworth and, on 3 separate occasions, returned to his compartment without doing so. What he did not wish found, the fact that he was not, had never been, and in all likelihood would never be, an accountant, and that his name was not Frederick Lowe. Dr. Harriet Quine occupied compartment 10 and had been, until Mrs. Marsh's discovery, the only other person awake in the first-class sleeper carriage. She was 44, a consultant physician attached to a hospital in Edinburgh, and she had the quality, rare and slightly unnerving in social situations, of absolute uncondescending attentiveness. When she listened to someone speak, she listened with her entire face, and people frequently told her things they had not intended to tell anyone. She was not beautiful, but she was the sort of woman whom men found themselves thinking about later, with a vague puzzlement they could not quite resolve. She had met Ashworth, she said, only this evening. They had been introduced in the restaurant car by Colonel Fawkes. She had found him charming. She had found him, beneath the charm, something else, though she had not yet named it, even to herself. She was travelling to Edinburgh for a medical conference. Her paper was on the pharmacological interaction of certain sedative compounds with cardiac medication. She had delivered this information in the restaurant car to mild and politely concealed incomprehension from her dinner companions. What she appeared to be, a competent professional, a chance fellow traveller, a woman with no connection to the dead man beyond one restaurant car acquaintance. What she was actually feeling, a very specific professional alertness that had begun when Ashworth mentioned, in passing, the name of his personal physician and had not subsided since. What she did not wish, found, the precise nature of her research interest in this particular pharmacological interaction, an interest that was not, or not entirely, academic. Mr. Peter Ashworth occupied compartment 11 at the far end of the carriage, and he was, simply, the dead man's son. He was 32, dark where his father had been fair, and he had the look of a man perpetually braced for impact. He had been dining with his father, sitting opposite him in the restaurant car with the rigid, overcorrect posture of a person determined to behave, in public, with perfect propriety. Their conversation had been quiet and, to all appearances, perfectly civil. Mrs. Vane, who had been watching with the professional attention of a portrait painter, had observed that the younger Ashworth had held his wine-glass so tightly at one point that she had been mildly surprised it did not shatter. What he appeared to be, a dutiful son accompanying an elderly father on a journey. What he was actually feeling, a rage so cold and so long-standing that it had ceased to feel like rage and felt instead simply like the ground beneath his feet, always there, always solid, always slightly treacherous. What he did not wish, found. What he had said to his father in the corridor at 11:15 when he had believed, incorrectly, as it would transpire, that everyone else was asleep. These, then, were the inhabitants of the world that the Caledonian Night Express had, for the duration of this October night, sealed together in its mahogany and brass first-class carriage, a woman with a letter, a soldier with documents, an artist with a photograph, a man with a false name, a doctor with a dangerous specialty, and a son with cold fury in his heart, and, somewhere among them, though Mrs. Marsh did not yet know this, and Inspector Glennie would not know it until morning, and the passengers themselves would not know it until a small Belgian gentleman with a remarkable moustache chose to tell them. Somewhere among them was a person who had picked up a glass, rinsed it clean with extraordinary care, replaced it beside a dead man's hand, and returned to their compartment to wait for Edinburgh. The train ran on through the darkness, and the wheels on the rails said almost there, almost there, almost there, and the night pressed close against the windows, and no one slept. The British Transport Police reached the train at Carlisle. It was, by then, 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, and the Caledonian Night Express had been held at the station platform for 22 minutes. an indignity that caused the conductor, Mr. Briggs, considerable professional anguish, and which had woken, through the gentle hydraulic shudder of brakes applied and motion ceased, several of the passengers who had previously managed to sleep. Inspector Glennie came aboard with 2 constables, and the particular expression of a man roused from bed at short notice, who intends to resolve matters as efficiently as possible and return to it. He was a solid, capable man in his mid-50s, Inspector Glennie. He had investigated 3 deaths on railway property in his career, 2 of which had been entirely natural and 1 of which had been entirely obvious. And he approached compartment 7 with the methodical competence of someone who expects to find, upon examination, a heart attack. He examined. He conferred with the police surgeon, who had been roused from a house in Carlisle and who arrived 20 minutes later with his bag and his displeasure. He did not find a heart attack, or rather, he found something that resembled one so closely that it would have deceived nearly anyone. The police surgeon, to his credit, was not deceived, and it was he who first used, carefully and with appropriate professional qualification, the word suspicious. It was at this point that Mr. Briggs, the conductor, recalled something. He knocked, with considerable diffidence, on the door of compartment 4. The door opened almost immediately. This was, in itself, slightly unnerving. The knock had been tentative. The knock of a man uncertain of his welcome at 3:40 in the morning, and the immediate response suggested that the occupant of compartment 4 had not only been awake, but had been waiting, with some patience, for precisely this sort of interruption. Hercule Poirot stood in the doorway of his compartment, fully dressed. This required a moment's consideration, because it was not the state of dress that one expected to find a man in at 20 minutes to 4 in the morning on a stationary train in Carlisle. And yet, there was nothing hurried or improvised about his appearance. The dark suit was immaculate, not a single crease that had not been intentionally placed there by its tailor. The shoes, which were of patent leather and gleamed with a dedication to shine that bordered on the spiritual, showed not the slightest concession to the hour. The famous moustaches, those magnificent, improbable moustaches, waxed to their most precise horizontality, were in a condition that suggested either that Poirot had not slept at all, or that he attended to them immediately upon waking with the same seriousness that other men reserved for prayer. He regarded Mr. Briggs with eyes that were small, very green, and enormously alert. "Ah," said Poirot, "you have come about the difficulty in compartment 7. Mr. Briggs opened his mouth, found nothing ready in it, and closed it again. "You were not asleep," he finally managed. "No," said Poirot pleasantly, "I was not. I heard Madame Marsh pass my door at 23 minutes past 2. I heard her return 11 minutes later, at a considerably accelerated pace, accompanied by a gentleman I took to be yourself. Subsequently, I heard the particular quality of silence that descends upon a corridor when those present within it are engaged in the management of something very serious." He paused. "I have been waiting with the patience that is one of my few genuine virtues for someone to think to inform me. Yes, quite. I beg your pardon, Monsieur Poirot." Briggs straightened slightly, with the reflex of a man remembering belatedly to whom he was speaking. The little Belgian's reputation was, in certain circles, a thing of considerable weight. "Inspector Glennie that is, there has been a death in compartment 7. A Mr. Gerald Ashworth, and the surgeon has indicated that the circumstances are, that is to say, there may be a question," said Poirot gently, "of whether Monsieur Ashworth's death was entirely his own affair." "Yes," said Briggs, with evident relief at not having to say it himself. Poirot nodded once, with the minimal efficiency of a man confirming a calculation. "You will take me to Inspector Glennie, if you please." He moved through the corridor with a neatness and economy of motion that was slightly at odds with the slight rotundity of his figure. The walk of a cat, Mrs. Marsh would later say, which was perhaps not entirely accurate, but captured something true about the quality of his attention as he moved. His eyes travelled the length of the corridor as he walked it, The doors, the spacing between them, the small service alcove at the far end, the position of the attendant's folding chair, the cold cup of tea still sitting beside it. He paused at this last item for precisely 3 seconds, regarding the tea with an expression of mild but genuine interest, and then moved on without comment. Inspector Glennie, to his credit, had heard of Hercule Poirot and received him in the doorway of compartment 7 with the expression of a man who is professionally self-sufficient and personally not unwilling to accept assistance. "Monsieur Poirot, Briggs tells me you're aboard." "By what I confess was a happy coincidence," said Poirot. "Though perhaps coincidence is not quite the right word. I had been invited to Edinburgh by Lord Strathern, whose wife wishes to consult me on a matter of stolen jewellery. A thing entirely trivial, I feared, until this moment. Now I begin to think the universe has arranged my itinerary with more purposefulness than Lord Strathern." He looked past Glennie into the compartment with a calm, unhurried regard. "You will permit me?" Glennie stepped aside. Poirot entered the compartment and stood quite still in its centre for a long moment, doing, apparently, nothing at all. This was, in Poirot's experience, the single most important phase of any investigation, and the one most consistently undervalued by those around him. They expected movement, examination, the deployment of magnifying glasses and forceps. They expected, in short, the drama of detection. What Poirot knew, and they did not, was that the most revealing thing about any scene was not what one found by searching it, but what one observed by simply looking, by standing in the middle of a room and allowing it quietly to declare itself. The compartment declared itself. The body, arranged with a neatness that was not the neatness of natural death. The hands at the sides precisely placed. The evening clothes still fully on. The tie loosened by exactly the degree that suggested deliberate adjustment rather than unconscious agitation during sleep. The glass on the shelf, empty, clean. No ring on the wood. No residue. Polished, almost lovingly, to transparency. The small window above the berth, latched, but not with the full engagement of its mechanism. Someone had closed it hastily or had not quite pushed it home. The paperback novel on the upper shelf, a Christie, as it happened. Poirot permitted himself the very smallest interior smile at this, placed face down with its spine bent, as though the reader had been interrupted mid-chapter. And then the thing that none of the others had seen, because none of them had been looking in quite the right way, with quite the right quality of attention. On the floor beside the berth, half beneath it, caught against the small lip of the metal bed frame, a single cufflink, gold, octagonal, with a dark blue enamel center. The sort of cufflink that went in pairs, and its pair was, Poirot noted, still in the cuff of the dead man's right sleeve. He did not touch it. He looked at it for 7 seconds, with the focused tranquility of a jeweler assessing a stone. "Tell me," he said to Inspector Glennie, without turning round, "when you have spoken to the passengers and the staff. And I assume, Inspector, that you have woken those who were sleeping?" "We have, yes. Constable Forbes is taking preliminary statements in the restaurant car." "Bon. Tell me, did any person report hearing sounds, disturbance, movement in the corridor at any time during the night?" "Nothing conclusive. Mrs. Marsh heard nothing until she found the door open. The colonel in 8 says he's a heavy sleeper." "The young man in 11? Glennie consulted his notes. "Peter Ashworth, the victim's son, says he heard his father's door close at some point before midnight, but can't be more precise." "His father's door close," repeated Poirot, with a thoughtfulness so slight it was almost imperceptible. "Not open, close. That's what he said." "Yes," said Poirot softly. "Yes, that is very interesting." He turned from the compartment, stepping into the corridor with the serene finality of a man who has seen what he came to see. "I have one small question, Inspector, before I intrude upon your investigation no further than you permit." Glennie, who had a feeling he was about to permit rather more than he'd intended, nodded. "The attendant," said Poirot. "His tea was cold when Madame Marsh passed his station at 2:03 The tea, I think, has not been touched for some considerable time. Where was the attendant between, shall we say, 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock this morning?" Inspector Glennie looked at his notes. Then he looked at the cold cup of tea. Then he looked at Hercule Poirot, with the expression of a man revising quietly and without fanfare a number of his initial assumptions. "I don't yet know," he said. "No," said Poirot without reproach. "But I think, my friend, that we shall find it matters." He smoothed the front of his jacket with both hands, adjusted a cufflink that required no adjustment, and turned toward the restaurant car with the composed, unhurried air of a man who has just arrived at the beginning of something interesting. Behind him, the Caledonian Night Express sat in the floodlit silence of Carlisle Station, the dark countryside pressing close on every side, and in compartment 7, Gerald Ashworth lay in the amber lamplight with his hands at his sides and his face the color of old wax. And the clean glass beside him caught the light and gave nothing away. Poirot had requisitioned, with the polite implacability that was one of his most effective social tools, the restaurant car. It was, he explained to Inspector Glennie, the most suitable space available, sufficiently removed from compartment 7 to allow the passengers a degree of psychological comfort, sufficiently enclosed to prevent the casual departure of anyone whose comfort he did not, at this particular juncture, wish to encourage. Glennie, who was conducting his own interviews at the forward end of the carriage with Constable Forbes, had agreed with the slightly distracted air of a man who suspects he is being managed and cannot quite identify the mechanism. Poirot sat at the table nearest the window, his back to the dark glass, a small cup of what passed for coffee on this train before him. He had regarded it upon arrival with an expression of resigned sorrow and drunk it anyway. And he received each passenger in turn with the warmth, the attentiveness, and the very specific quality of stillness that made people, almost without exception, say rather more than they had planned to. He had learned, over a long career, that the interview was not a search for information. Information people withheld. What they could not withhold, what no amount of preparation or composure could entirely suppress, was themselves. Miss Sylvia Cartwright came first, at her own request, which was itself instructive. She was perfectly composed. The hair, the posture, the expression of cooperative distress, all of it precisely calibrated. She sat across from Poirot, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes conveying the frank, unguarded look of a woman with nothing whatsoever to conceal, which Poirot had long ago identified as one of the most reliably suspicious expressions in the human repertoire. "You knew Monsieur Ashworth," said Poirot. "Not a question." A microsecond's pause. "We had met, professionally. I worked as secretary to his solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, in Gray's Inn. There were documents to be signed, that sort of thing. I wouldn't say I knew him." "And yet," said Poirot pleasantly, "when you saw him on the platform at Euston this evening, you did not greet him." The composure held, but something behind it shifted, a barely perceptible realignment, like a building settling. "I didn't notice him on the platform." "No?" Poirot's tone remained entirely mild. "I ask only because you boarded the train quite hastily, I am told, the last passenger to board before the whistle, which is unusual for a woman traveling with only one piece of luggage, as though, perhaps, she had been waiting on the platform for longer than expected and then found, quite suddenly, a reason to board with some urgency." He smiled. "But perhaps I am too imaginative." "Perhaps," said Miss Cartwright, and smiled back, and the two of them regarded each other with perfect pleasantness across the small table. "She is afraid," thought Poirot, "but she is also intelligent, and she knows that fear displayed is as damaging as guilt. She will give me the minimum and dress it as the maximum." "You dined alone," he said. "Did you speak with Monsieur Ashworth during the evening?" "Briefly. He stopped at my table. To be polite, I assumed. We exchanged a few words about the journey. Nothing significant." "He stopped at your table," Poirot repeated gently. "He came to you?" "Yes." "And the conversation? These few words about the journey? How long did they last, these words?" The pause this time was 3 full seconds, 4 or 5 minutes perhaps. "And during these 4 or 5 minutes about the journey, did Monsieur Ashworth mention, by any chance, any correspondence?" "Any letters?" Something moved across Miss Cartwright's face with the speed and definitiveness of a cloud shadow crossing open ground, and was gone. "No," she said. "Nothing like that." Poirot nodded with the serene satisfaction of a man whose experiment has produced exactly the result he anticipated. He asked 2 more questions. Trivial ones, about the time she had retired and whether she had heard any sounds in the corridor, received answers that were plausible and probably false, and thanked her with genuine warmth. After she had gone, he sat for a moment with his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. A letter, he thought. She is terrified about a letter, and Ashworth came to her table. Not she to him. He had something she wanted, or wanted back. He filed this with precision in the immaculate cabinet of his mind, and called for Colonel Fawkes. Colonel Bertram Fawkes arrived with the energy of a man determined to be helpful, which Poirot found, in its own way, equally suspicious. He sat down heavily, placed both large hands flat on the table in a gesture of open-palmed candor, and said, "Dreadful business, absolutely dreadful. Poor old Gerald." "You were close friends," said Poirot. 22 years. Met in Nairobi. Business, not the army. That was well behind me by then. Kept in touch ever since. Solid man. Reliable." The colonel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Or so I believed. "Ah," thought Poirot. "There it is. You had perhaps some recent reason to revise this belief." The large hands on the table moved. Not much, but enough. Nothing specific. He'd seemed distracted lately. Not himself. "You dined together this evening?" "We did." His suggestion, originally, said he wanted to talk, catch up. But when it came to it, he was evasive, kept steering the conversation onto other things, other people. The colonel's eyes, which were pale blue and direct, met Poirot's with an expression that was Candor's excellent imitation. "I'd been hoping to discuss a business matter, an investment we'd made together some years ago. There have been some complications." "Complications," said Poirot sympathetically. How disagreeable. And Monsieur Ashworth was unwilling to discuss these complications. He said we'd talk in Edinburgh. There was someone he needed to see first, he said. The colonel paused. I asked him who. He smiled, the way he had, that damned smile of his, and said it was better I didn't know. Poirot let the silence sit for a moment, comfortable and receptive as an open hand. "Tell me, Colonel, did you, at any point during the evening, visit Monsieur Ashworth in his compartment?" "No." "Said good night to him in the corridor around 11:30 and went straight to bed." "And you slept well?" "Like the dead." The colonel heard his own words and colored slightly. Poor choice of phrase. "Yes. Didn't hear a thing until your man knocked." He is lying about the sleep, thought Poirot, but possibly not about the visit. The documents in the attaché case trouble him greatly. He is aware that they will be found, and he is calculating, even now, how to explain them. But a man calculating how to explain documents is not necessarily a man who has committed murder. He is, however, a man who needed Ashworth alive long enough to reach Edinburgh. The clue planted itself quietly in Poirot's mind. The colonel had said Ashworth wanted to see someone in Edinburgh before discussing the business matter. Someone Ashworth had not named. The misdirection was equally quiet. Fawkes was so obviously, so productively suspicious, the documents, the motive, the proximity, that he invited the conclusion a little too readily. Poirot noted this with the professional appreciation of a craftsman recognizing another's technique, even when that technique had not been deliberately employed. Mrs. Theodora Vane arrived like a change of weather. She settled into the chair with the billowing authority of her plum traveling suit and regarded Poirot with the frank, assessing attention she normally reserved for a new canvas. "You have a remarkable head," she said by way of opening. "I am told so," said Poirot with perfect equanimity. "The cranial structure is unusually defined. I should like to paint you one day." She waved a hand hung with amber beads. "But you wish to ask me about poor Gerald. You knew him well, madame?" "I knew him long ago," she said, and the distinction, delivered with perfect lightness, carried in it the entire weight of 31 years. "We were Acquainted in another life, another century, it sometimes seems. I had not seen him in, many years. Tonight was, in point of fact, the first time we had been in the same room since 1954. A long interval. A necessary one. She said it without drama, without invitation, as a simple statement of geographical fact. We did not part as friends, Gerald and I. There were circumstances. The amber beads shifted as she settled herself more firmly in the chair. I will tell you what you will find out anyway, Monsieur Poirot, because I find that telling things oneself is invariably less unpleasant than having them extracted. I had a son, Julian. He died in 1955. A climbing accident in the Alps, they said, and I believe it was an accident, whatever else I believe. A pause. Gerald Ashworth had been his business partner. There was a dispute about money. There is always a dispute about money when a young man dies without a will. It was not resolved to my satisfaction. I am sorry, said Poirot, and meant it. I am long past sorry, said Mrs. Vane, with a composure that was not coldness, but something harder and more durable, the composure of a woman who has alchemized grief into material for living. I saw Gerald on the platform at Euston, and I thought, well, the world is smaller than one plans for. I came aboard. I dined. I observed the assembled company with the attention that is my professional habit, and I went to bed. You did not speak with him? I had nothing to say to him that would have served any useful purpose. Poirot nodded slowly. During your observation of the assembled company, you are an observer of faces, madam, of great professional skill. Did you notice anything that struck you as unusual? Any tension, any exchange, any wrongness? Mrs. Vane was quiet for a moment, and in the quality of that quiet Poirot recognized genuine recollection, not performance, not calculation, but the real, focused effort of memory. The son, she said at last, Peter Ashworth. I watched him at dinner, and I thought, that young man is sitting across from someone he hates with a very complete hatred, and Gerald knew it. And didn't care, or rather cared in the way that people care when they find the caring of others a form of power. She met Poirot's eyes. And the young woman, Miss Cartwright. She watched Gerald the entire evening from behind her composure, like a cat at a mousehole. A pause. Though who was the cat and who was the mouse, I confess I could not entirely determine. Excellent, thought Poirot. Excellent and precise. He thanked her with genuine admiration, and she departed in a billow of plum and amber, leaving behind her, without knowing it, the most accurate single observation yet made about the evening's events. Mr. Frederick Lowe was the most difficult interview of the four, not because he was clever, though Poirot suspected he was, but because he had the particular quality of self-erasure that made it extremely hard to find the edges of a person. He answered every question with the mild, cooperative accuracy of a man with nothing to hide, and Poirot, watching him, felt the curious sensation of pressing against a surface that gave way slightly under pressure, but never quite broke. He had dined in his compartment. He had retired early. He had not known Mr. Ashworth. He had not left his compartment during the night. You did not know Monsieur Ashworth? Poirot repeated. No, I'd never met him. And yet, said Poirot, with the gentle air of a man raising a small and possibly irrelevant point, you are travelling from London to Edinburgh at the same time as a man called Ashworth. And your firm? You said you worked for a firm in Edinburgh. Which firm, if I may ask? The answer came a half-second too quickly. Meridian Financial Associates in George Street. Ah, said Poirot. Meridian Financial. He said it with the tone of a man who recognizes the name, though his expression gave no indication of whether this was true. You must know Mr. Ashworth's name very well, then. He was the principal shareholder in Meridian's parent company until 3 years ago. The silence that followed this observation was, in Poirot's considerable experience, among the most eloquent he had encountered. I may have heard the name, said Mr. Lowe carefully. In passing, agreed Poirot pleasantly. Well, that is perfectly understandable. He closed his small notebook, in which he had written almost nothing, and smiled with great warmth. "I think that is all for the moment, Monsieur Lowe. I am grateful for your patience." He watched the man, who was not an accountant and not named Frederick Lowe, walk back through the restaurant car with the controlled, even pace of someone exercising great self-discipline, and he thought, "You came on this train for Ashworth, and now Ashworth is dead, and you don't yet know if that is a catastrophe or a deliverance." The planted clue, a man with a false name connected to Ashworth's financial history. The misdirection. The terror in his eyes, which pointed so convincingly toward guilt that it almost obscured the other possibility that what Frederick Lowe was afraid of was not being found out as a murderer, but being found out as something else entirely. Poirot sat alone in the restaurant car for a moment after the last interview, the grey pre-dawn light beginning, almost imperceptibly, to dilute the darkness beyond the windows. The train still sat at Carlisle. The coffee was cold. Outside, on the platform, a pigeon walked with the self-important air of a creature that has not been informed of the gravity of the situation. Poirot watched it with affection, then reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small notebook. He wrote 4 names. Against each name, he placed a single word, not a description of guilt or innocence, but of psychology, the word that, in his estimation, most precisely described the engine running beneath each person's careful surface. Against Miss Cartwright's name, he wrote, fear. Against Colonel Fawkes, desperation. Against Mrs. Vane, grief. Against Mr. Lowe, exposure. He looked at the list for a long moment, then added a 5th name, Dr. Harriet Quine, whom Glennie had interviewed but Poirot had not yet spoken to directly, and beside it, after a pause, he wrote a single word that was not a psychological state, but a professional designation. He wrote, knowledge. Then he closed the notebook, finished the cold coffee with the air of a man performing a small but necessary penance, and went to find Inspector Glennie. The sun rose over the Cumbrian hills at 23 minutes past 7. It did so with the particular, indifferent beauty of an English autumn morning, the light arriving not all at once but in gradual degrees, first a pale silver at the horizon's edge, then a washing of rose and amber across the high fells, until the whole landscape was illuminated in that cool, clear radiance that belongs exclusively to the northern counties and has no equivalent further south. It was, objectively, a very fine morning. Hercule Poirot observed it through the restaurant car window and found it, under the circumstances, somewhat tactless. The Caledonian Night Express remained at Carlisle. It had now been stationary for 4 hours and 19 minutes, a fact that caused Mr. Briggs, the conductor, a distress so acute it had passed beyond agitation into a kind of numb, professional grief. The Edinburgh passengers, those in the 2nd and 3rd class carriages, who had been told only that there was a medical incident requiring the train's delay, had progressed from puzzlement through irritation to the resigned philosophical acceptance that the British travelling public reserves for circumstances entirely beyond their control. Several had produced newspapers. One elderly gentleman in a tweed cap had fallen asleep again and seemed entirely content. In the 1st-class sleeper carriage, the atmosphere was of a different and considerably less comfortable quality. The 6 passengers had been asked to remain available, which they had interpreted with varying degrees of willingness as an instruction to congregate in the restaurant car. They sat at separate tables, for the most part, with the over-careful spacing of people who are aware of each other's presence to a degree that precludes the ordinary courtesies of proximity. Miss
Cartwright had a cup of tea she was not drinking. Colonel Fawkes had a plate of toast he was not eating. Mrs. Vane had produced, from somewhere within the architectural complexity of her handbag, a small sketchbook and was drawing, with quick, sure strokes, the view from the window, or appearing to. Peter Ashworth sat alone at the far end of the carriage, staring at the table in front of him, with the concentrated emptiness of a man holding a very great deal of something entirely inside himself. Mr. Frederick Lowe had not appeared. He had sent word, via Constable Forbes, that he was feeling unwell and was resting in his compartment. Dr. Quine sat with her hands around a coffee cup, her expression alert and private, like a woman attending a lecture she has already read the book for.
Colonel Fawkes had a plate of toast he was not eating. Mrs. Vane had produced, from somewhere within the architectural complexity of her handbag, a small sketchbook and was drawing, with quick, sure strokes, the view from the window, or appearing to. Peter Ashworth sat alone at the far end of the carriage, staring at the table in front of him with the concentrated emptiness of a man holding a very great deal of something entirely inside himself. Mr. Frederick Lowe had not appeared. He had sent word, via Constable Forbes, that he was feeling unwell and was resting in his compartment. Dr. Quine sat with her hands around a coffee cup, her expression alert and private, like a woman attending a lecture she has already read the book for. Inspector Glennie entered the restaurant car at 7:27 with the bearing of a man who has reached a conclusion, and conclusions, in Glennie's experience, were things to be delivered promptly and without unnecessary elaboration. He had, it must be said, done his work thoroughly. He had taken statements, examined the compartment, consulted by telephone with both his superior in Glasgow and the police surgeon, and had arrived at a reconstruction of events that was coherent, evidence-supported, and, he was prepared to admit, not entirely his own. The train attendant had provided, upon extended questioning by Constable Forbes, a piece of information that had clarified the picture considerably. The attendant, one Thomas Creel, 26, 8 months in the employ of the railway company, had been absent from his station between the hours of 11:15 and 1:40 in the morning. He had been, he confessed, with the crimson embarrassment of a young man caught in a minor dereliction in the third-class carriage, where a young woman of his acquaintance was travelling to Glasgow. He could produce her name, her seat number, and, if pressed, several corroborating witnesses. He had nothing to do with compartment 7. This established, Inspector Glennie had turned his attention to the question of access, opportunity, and, most illuminatingly, a small glass phial, empty, discovered in the waste receptacle at the far end of the first-class corridor, which the police surgeon had examined with considerable interest. Glennie stood at the front of the restaurant car and addressed its occupants with the directness of a man who considers ceremony a form of inefficiency. "I want to thank you all for your patience," he said, in a tone that acknowledged the thanks were largely pro forma. "I'm in a position to share some preliminary findings. The police surgeon's examination indicates that Mr. Ashworth's death was not from natural causes. There is evidence consistent with the administration of a substance, the specific nature of which will require laboratory analysis, but which the surgeon believes to be a fast-acting sedative compound in a significantly elevated dose." He paused. "In plain terms, Mr. Ashworth was drugged, and the dosage was sufficient to cause cardiac arrest in a man of his age and his particular medical history." "What medical history?" said Colonel Fawkes sharply. "Mr. Ashworth had a heart condition, diagnosed 14 months ago. He was on a prescribed regimen of cardiac medication." Glennie consulted his notes. "His personal physician in London has been contacted." Poirot, who was sitting to one side of the room, in the attitude of a man present by courtesy rather than necessity, observed the faces of the assembled passengers with the calm, receptive attention of an audience member who has already read the programme notes. Miss Cartwright's face, carefully arranged into an expression of shocked concern. Colonel Fawkes, a rapid, almost mechanical calculation moving behind his eyes. Mrs. Vane, very still, with a stillness that was not shock but recognition, the recognition of a woman who has spent 31 years expecting something like this. Peter Ashworth. He had closed his eyes. One hand, on the table before him, had curled slowly into a fist, and then, with evident effort, uncurled again. Dr. Quine, watching Inspector Glennie with a precise, clinical attention, as though assessing the accuracy of a colleague's diagnosis. "The phial found in the corridor waste receptacle," Glennie continued, "contained traces of the compound in question. We believe the substance was introduced into Mr. Ashworth's whiskey glass during the evening, likely while he was in the restaurant car, or shortly thereafter. The glass was subsequently cleaned, an action that indicates premeditation and presence of mind." He looked up from his notes. "On the basis of the evidence currently available, I am satisfied that the primary suspect in this matter is—" A slight pause, the only concession Glennie made to theatre. Mr. Peter Ashworth. The name fell into the room with the clean, heavy finality of a gavel. Peter Ashworth opened his eyes. "The evidence," Glennie said, with the efficient compassion of a professional delivering an unpleasant truth, "includes witness testimony placing Mr. Peter Ashworth in conversation with his father in the corridor at 11:15, a conversation described by one witness as heated, though conducted quietly. Mr. Ashworth had both the proximity and the opportunity. Additionally, Mr. Gerald Ashworth's solicitor, contacted this morning, has confirmed that the terms of the deceased's will were recently revised and that Peter Ashworth stood to inherit, or, under the revised terms, to not inherit, a very considerable estate." "You have it backwards," said Peter Ashworth. His voice was quiet and very steady. "The will was revised against me. My father told me so last night. That was what we argued about." "Which provides," said Glennie, not without sympathy, "a compelling motive for a son who has just discovered he is to be disinherited." The silence in the restaurant car was the particular silence of people hearing something that sounds horribly like sense. It was into this silence that Hercule Poirot spoke, quietly, almost diffidently, from his position to one side, in the manner of a man raising a small administrative point at the end of a meeting. "Inspector," he said, "before you proceed, you will forgive me. I have one very small question. A trivial matter, perhaps." Glennie looked at him with the expression of a man who suspects the trivial matter will not be trivial. "Monsieur Poirot." "The file," said Poirot. "The small glass file found in the waste receptacle in the corridor. You say it contained traces of the compound, the sedative." "That's correct." "And the receptacle, the waste receptacle at the far end of the corridor. It is emptied, I imagine, by the attendant at regular intervals during the journey." Glennie consulted Forbes briefly. According to Creel, he emptied all the corridor receptacles at approximately 10:45 in the evening, before he left his station. "So the file was placed in the receptacle after 10:45, said Poirot, "after the attendant had emptied it and before he, or anyone else, discovered it this morning." He nodded pleasantly. "And the receptacle. It is at the far end of the first-class corridor, the end away from compartment 7. "Yes." Said Poirot, in the tone of a man making a note to himself about something of no immediate relevance. And one more very small thing. The file itself. Glass, you said. Small. The sort of thing that might be carried in a pocket, or perhaps in a bag." He turned to Dr. Quine with an expression of mild, sociable curiosity, entirely devoid of accusation. "Dr. Quine, you are a physician. In your medical bag, for I assume you travel as a sensible doctor with a medical bag." "I do," said Dr. Quine. Her voice was level. "Such files, small glass files for injectable or concentrated compounds, these are the sort of thing a physician might carry?" "They are." "And they are," Poirot tilted his head slightly, "they are, by their nature, sealed when full and transparent when empty?" "Yes." "So that an empty file and a full file, in appearance, are, how would one say, quite similar, quite easy to confuse in a hurried moment, in a dim light?" Dr. Quine looked at him steadily. "I suppose they might be." "Yes," said Poirot, and smiled with great amiability. "Yes, I thought so. Thank you, Doctor. That is all I wish to know." He sat back in his chair and resumed the expression of a man present by courtesy rather than necessity, and said nothing further. Inspector Glennie looked at him for a long moment, with the frustrated respect of a man who knows he has just been shown something, but cannot yet determine what he has been shown, and then turned back to the business of the room. The question had lasted 45 seconds. To everyone present, it had appeared to be a detour into the technical and the peripheral, a small man's small concern with small details, signifying nothing in particular. No one in the room, not Glennie, not Forbes, not the 6 passengers with their secrets and their composures, would understand what Poirot had actually asked until the very end of everything. No one, that is, except the person for whom the question had been intended, who understood it perfectly, and who, for the first time, looked at Hercule Poirot with something that was not calculation, not performance, and not composure. It was, for just a moment, pure and undisguised fear. Poirot did not look back. He was examining the middle distance with the benign, unfocused attention of a man thinking about something else entirely, and he looked, to all outward appearances, entirely harmless. He was, of course, thinking about nothing else at all. Poirot took a walk. This was not, on the face of it, a remarkable thing. The train remained stationary at Carlisle. The morning had advanced to something approaching respectability, and a man might reasonably wish to stretch his legs after a night spent in a sleeper berth. Inspector Glennie had released the passengers to their compartments. Peter Ashworth, with the particular careful courtesy reserved for those who are not yet formally accused but are not quite free either, and the first-class carriage had subsided into the uneasy quiet of a place where everyone is listening through walls. Poirot walked the length of the first-class corridor 3 times. He walked it slowly, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes performing that particular exercise he privately called the second look, the deliberate act of seeing what was present rather than what was expected. On the first pass, he looked at the doors. On the second, he looked at the floor. On the third, he looked at the ceiling, which caused Constable Forbes, stationed at the corridor's end, to watch him with the careful blankness of a young man determined not to appear confused. Poirot found nothing new on the ceiling. He had not expected to. But he found something rather interesting in the looking, in the angle, specifically, of the small ventilation grate above compartment 9. It was not quite level. It had been, he thought, recently disturbed, and replaced with the haste of someone who lacked the time to be precise. He did not touch it. He stood beneath it for a moment, with the expression of a man admiring the craftsmanship of the ceiling molding, and then continued his walk. The psychological game, such as it was, began at 9:30. He started with Colonel Fawkes, which was deliberate. The colonel was in his compartment, the attaché case now sitting openly on the fold-out table, a decision Poirot interpreted immediately and correctly, as the colonel having decided that proactive transparency about the documents was preferable to the appearance of concealment. He had the look of a man who has spent the morning preparing a speech and is cautiously relieved to have someone to deliver it to. Poirot did not allow him to deliver it. "My dear Colonel," he said, settling into the small pull-down seat opposite with the ease of a man making a social call. "I want to speak to you, if I may, not about the documents in your case. We will arrive at those in their own time, but about something you said to me earlier that I found myself returning to." Fawkes blinked. "Oh? You said that Ashworth, at dinner, told you there was someone he needed to see in Edinburgh before you could discuss your business matter, someone whose identity he declined to share." Poirot settled his hands on his knees. "I have been thinking about this. A man does not travel to Edinburgh in secret, or in what he imagines to be secret, to see a business associate. Business associates, one makes appointments with, one sees them in offices at arranged times with solicitors present." He paused. "But a man who wishes to see someone and does not wish the nature of that meeting known. This is a different category of errand entirely." "I hadn't thought of it quite that way," said Fawkes, and the honest discomfort in his voice suggested this was true. "No," said Poirot gently, "but consider. Ashworth was a man who operated professionally in the management of other people's vulnerabilities. This is a harsh way of saying it, but I think you know it to be accurate." He met the colonel's eyes with an expression of entire sympathy and zero sentimentality. "Your investment, these documents, represent a difficulty for you. But the interesting question is not whether Ashworth created this difficulty. I suspect he did. The interesting question is why he was still creating difficulties at his age, with his wealth. A man who has what he needs does not continue to acquire leverage unless the leverage itself has become the point." A gentle pause. "Unless he was afraid of something and was building protections." The colonel was very still. "You think someone had something on Gerald?" "I think," said Poirot, with the careful precision of a man placing a single drop into a chemical solution and observing the reaction, "that a man who needed to see someone secretly in Edinburgh and who did not live to reach Edinburgh may have been closer to being a victim than a villain in certain respects." He rose. I merely wished you to think about this, mon ami. About who, in your long acquaintance with Ashworth, might have had cause to, how shall one say, hold something over him, rather than the reverse. He left the colonel in a state of rapidly reorganizing assumption, which was precisely what he had intended. He found Miss Cartwright in the corridor, which surprised him until he recognized that she had positioned herself there deliberately, that she had been waiting for him. This was new information about her character. She was not, ultimately, a woman who waited passively for events to arrive. When sufficiently frightened, she advanced to meet them. He respected this. Monsieur Poirot, she said, I should like to speak with you, and I with you, mademoiselle. Shall we? He gestured toward the restaurant car. Here is fine. She crossed her arms, which was not defiance but self-containment. I wasn't entirely honest with you this morning. No, agreed Poirot, without reproach. The letter. She said it, with the relief of a woman setting down something heavy. Gerald Ashworth had a letter I wrote to him 6 weeks ago. A private letter, personal in nature, and written in a moment of... It was ill-considered. He was using it as a means of pressure. Her chin rose slightly. He wanted my employer, Mr. Pemberton, to alter certain clauses in a legal document relating to his estate. Gerald knew that I had access to the files. He wanted me to facilitate certain changes that Mr. Pemberton had not been made aware of. Document fraud, said Poirot, without changing his tone. Yes, she met his eyes steadily. I refused. He came to my table last night to tell me that my refusal had an expiration date, that I had until we reached Edinburgh to change my mind. Poirot regarded her with an expression in which sympathy and assessment were so evenly balanced as to be indistinguishable. And the letter, did you recover it? Something flickered. No, I don't know where it is now. I see. He was quiet for a moment. Mademoiselle, I will tell you something that may be of comfort, or may not. The letter, wherever it is now the property of the dead. And the dead, in my experience, are very poor blackmailers. He paused. But I must ask you, when Ashworth came to your table last evening and delivered this ultimatum, did he seem to you a man in full command of his situation? Or did he seem a man who was himself in some way under pressure? She thought about this seriously, which he appreciated. He seemed, yes, now that you ask. He was confident on the surface. He always was. But there was something underneath it, a restlessness. He kept glancing toward the door of the restaurant car, as though expecting someone, or avoiding someone, she said. Poirot nodded slowly. This confirmed something he had already begun to suspect, and it moved a piece in the interior arrangement of his mind with a soft, definitive click. He thanked her and moved on, and she watched him go with the expression of a woman who has handed something to someone more competent to carry it and is not entirely certain how she feels about this. The conversation with Peter Ashworth was the most delicate, and Poirot approached it with the care of a man crossing uncertain ice. He found the young man exactly where he expected to find him, sitting in his compartment, not resting, not reading, simply sitting, with the absolute stillness of a person engaged in a purely interior battle. He looked up when Poirot appeared in the doorway, and his face had the raw, scoured quality of someone who has been crying, though not recently, and whose control was now total and somewhat brittle. Poirot did not ask if he might come in. He simply sat, in the manner of a man who has known grief himself, and understands that the request for permission can itself be a small cruelty. They think I did it, said Peter Ashworth, not with outrage, but with a flattened exhaustion. Inspector Glennie thinks it, said Poirot carefully. This is not quite the same thing. And what do you think, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot considered the young man before him with the full weight of his attention, the red-rimmed eyes, the white knuckles, the jaw set with the rigidity of a man biting down on something that would otherwise escape as sound. I think, said Poirot slowly, that you hated your father with a completeness and a consistency that argues a great deal of cause. I think you said something to him in the corridor at 11:15 that you have not told Inspector Glennie. A pause. And I think that whatever you said, it was honest, and that honesty, in this case, is your alibi. if only you will permit it to function." Peter Ashworth looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, the Cumbrian hills sat in their morning light with magnificent unconcern. "I told him," he said at last, very quietly, "that I knew what he had done to Julian Vane." The name entered the compartment and seemed to alter the air in it. "Julian Vane," said Poirot without inflection. "Mrs. Vane's son. He was my father's business partner. In 1954, he found out something about the company accounts, about what my father had been doing with investor money. He was going to go to the authorities." Peter Ashworth's voice was steady and without theatre, which made it worse. "My father knew. There was an argument in the Alps, at the top of a climb." He stopped. "Julian Vane didn't fall. He was pushed. My father told me so himself 3 years ago when he thought he was dying and then recovered. He told me as a confidence, a thing between father and son, a pause that had tremendous weight in it. He thought it would bind me to him. Instead," said Poirot gently, "it became the wall between you." "I have been trying to decide what to do with it for 3 years," said Peter Ashworth. "Last night I told him I had decided. I was going to Edinburgh to speak to a solicitor. I was going to make a statement." Poirot sat with this for a moment in the quiet of the small compartment, while outside the hills were golden and indifferent. He understood now the cold fury, the rigid posture at dinner, the wine-glass held too tightly. He understood the argument in the corridor and the impossibility of sleep afterward. "You went back to your compartment after speaking with him in the corridor," said Poirot, "and you did not leave it again." "No." "And your father was alive when you left him?" "He was." The voice cracked finely like good china under too much heat. "He was angry. He was very much alive." Poirot rose. He had one further thing to say, and he chose his words with the precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. "Monsieur Ashworth, Peter, the person who killed your father did so, I believe, not in the heat of old hatred, but with the cold intention of someone protecting a very specific and very immediate secret, a secret that had nothing to do with Julian Vane." He paused at the door. "But in revealing what you knew to your father last night, I think you may have, quite inadvertently, forced the killer's hand. Your ultimatum and theirs were delivered on the same evening to the same man, and together they made his death, from the killer's perspective, urgent in a way it had not previously been." He left Peter Ashworth with this, the terrible, complicated knowledge that an act of courage and long-delayed justice had perhaps precipitated a murder, and moved back into the corridor. He paused outside compartment 9, where Mr. Frederick Lowe remained indisposed. He did not knock. He stood outside the door for a moment, looking at the ventilation grate above it with an expression of benign academic interest. Then he looked at the door itself and said, very quietly, in a voice pitched precisely for the hearing of someone who was, as he had expected, standing just on the other side of it, "I know what you are, monsieur. Not what you have done, I am not yet certain of that, but what you are. And I think, when you have considered your situation carefully, you will find that speaking to me is preferable to the alternative." A long silence from behind the door. Then, quietly, "Tomorrow." "Tonight," said Poirot pleasantly, and walked on. Behind him, in their separate compartments, the passengers of the Caledonian Night Express sat with their secrets and their calculations, and somewhere among them, Poirot knew with the cold certainty of long experience, a person was beginning to understand that the small, precise, immaculate Belgian gentleman who walked the corridors with his hands clasped behind his back was not, despite all appearances, a safe presence to be near. The psychological pressure was invisible, distributed, and total. It operated not through accusation, but through implication, the terrible implication that someone finally saw. Poirot straightened his cuffs, observed the ventilation grate one final time, and went to find a better cup of coffee. He did not find one, but the walk, at least, had been productive. It was Mrs. Theodora Vane who found the note. This was, in retrospect, entirely in keeping with the character of a woman who had spent 50 years looking at things with more attention than those around her considered strictly necessary. She found it at 11:40 in the morning, wedged, not accidentally, Poirot would later determine, but with the precise intentionality of someone who wished it found by a specific person, between the pages of the sketchbook she had left on the table in the restaurant car, when she had gone briefly to her compartment to retrieve a softer pencil. She brought it to Poirot without reading past the first line, which suggested both a fastidiousness and a self-knowledge that he found, under the circumstances, admirable. She had gone pale beneath the architecture of her composure, which, on a woman of Mrs. Vane's construction, was a considerable achievement, and she held the folded paper out to him at arm's length, in the manner of someone offering something that has unexpectedly revealed itself to be dangerous. "I think," she said with commendable steadiness, "that you should read this." The note was written on railway company stationery, the cream, embossed paper found in a small folder in each sleeper compartment, in a hand that was educated, precise, and under considerable stress. The stress was visible not in any deterioration of the letter forms, which remained controlled throughout, but in the pressure applied to the pen, which had scored the paper deeply enough to be felt on the reverse side. It read, "I cannot continue. What has been done tonight cannot be undone, and what I have carried for 30 years cannot be carried further. By the time this is read, the matter will have resolved itself. I wish only to say that Gerald Ashworth was not an innocent man, and that those who mourn him should consider carefully what it is they are mourning. The cufflink is under the bed. I put it there. I am sorry for the confusion this has caused. HQ." Poirot read it twice. Then he folded it with great care along its original creases and placed it in his breast pocket and said, "You will remain here, Madame Vane, if you please," and walked with a pace that was somewhat more rapid than his habitual one in the direction of compartment 10. The door was unlocked. This was the first thing. The second was the smell. Not the medicinal, sweetly wrong smell of compartment 7, but something sharper, more astringent, the smell of a clinical decision made in a small, enclosed space. Dr. Harriet Quine was sitting on the edge of her berth, fully dressed, her medical bag open on the fold-out table beside her. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was the color of the railway stationery, and she was breathing with the slow, deliberate regularity of a woman who is monitoring her own respiration as a clinical matter. On the shelf beside the bag sat a small glass of water, half empty, and beside it, with a neatness that was somehow the most disturbing element of the entire scene, a second phial, this one not empty, but 3/4 full, its contents a pale amber liquid, its stopper in place, set aside. She looked up when Poirot entered. Her eyes were very clear. "You didn't drink it," said Poirot. "It was not a question. I had it in my hand," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they are held by a conscious and disciplined effort. "For about 4 minutes I had it in my hand." A pause. "Then I put it down." Poirot sat. He did not speak immediately, which was, he had found, almost always the correct response to a moment of this particular quality. "The note," said Dr. Quine. "You've read it?" "I have." "Then you know." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "Or you think you know. I imagine, Monsieur Poirot, that you thought you knew considerably before you read the note." "I had certain indications," said Poirot carefully. "The pharmacological specialty. The reaction to Inspector Glennie's statement. The question I asked you in the restaurant car, about the files." He paused. "And one other thing, which I observed very early and said nothing about, because the time for it had not arrived." "What thing?" "At dinner last evening, in the restaurant car, I was present, you understand, though I dined alone and was not, I think, much noticed. I observed the moment when Colonel Fawkes introduced you to Gerald Ashworth. And I observed Ashworth's face in the moment of introduction." Poirot's voice was entirely gentle. "He knew your name, Doctor. He recognized it before you had spoken a word. And, for just a moment, a very brief moment, which I think no one else in the room saw, he was afraid." Dr. Quine was quiet for a long time. "Julian Vane was my patient," she said at last, before Edinburgh, before the hospital. I was a junior doctor, 26 years old, in a practice in Kensington. Julian was a patient there. We became, she paused, he was important to me. He was 29, and he was the most genuinely good person I have met in 44 years of knowing people, and he was killed by Gerald Ashworth on a mountainside in Switzerland, and no one did anything about it because no one could prove it, and Gerald Ashworth was the sort of man that other men with money and influence protected as a matter of professional courtesy. She said all of this in the measured, clinical tone of a woman presenting a case history. The detachment was so complete and so clearly achieved at considerable cost that Poirot felt, for a moment, the full weight of what 31 years of containing something can do to the vessel that contains it. "Your research," said Poirot. "The paper you are presenting in Edinburgh on the pharmacological interaction of sedative compounds with cardiac medication." "Yes. This research, it is not recent." "No." A slight, exhausted, almost smile. "It is not recent. You have known for some time of Ashworth's heart condition. His physician, Dr. Crawley, in Harley Street, was at a conference 2 years ago at which I presented an early version of the paper. He mentioned in conversation the name of a patient, not by name, but by profile, the age, the specific cardiac condition, the medication regimen, and the name came out later in the evening, in the way names do at conferences, when people have had a drink or two and are talking as colleagues rather than professionals. She looked at Poirot steadily. I knew then exactly what could be done, and how, and with what, and I began to think about it. "And you are telling me," said Poirot, with infinite care, "that you killed Gerald Ashworth." "I am telling you," said Dr. Quine, "that I wrote a confession to that effect and that I intended to ensure I was not in a position to contradict it." A pause. "I am less certain now than I was an hour ago of a number of things." Poirot looked at her. The clear, tired eyes, the hands in the lap, the file set aside with its stopper in place, and he felt the machinery of the case shudder and reconfigure around him, pieces that had been moving in one direction suddenly, forcefully, arrested, because something was wrong. Not with the confession. The confession was real, the emotion was real, the 31-year grief was as real as anything in the room. But something in the architecture of what she was describing did not align with what Poirot had observed. And what Poirot had observed was, in his experience, a more reliable foundation than what he was being told. He thought of the clean glass. Impossibly, pointlessly clean. For a person of Dr. Quine's intelligence would know that a cleaned glass was itself evidence of interference. A truly careful poisoner would have taken the glass, or left it dirty, with an innocent residue. He thought of the cufflink. The note had said, "I put it there," but the cufflink had been under the bed, against the frame, in the position of something that had fallen and rolled. Not placed, fallen. He thought of the ventilation grate above compartment 9, slightly askew, recently disturbed. He thought of Mr. Frederick Lowe, indisposed in his compartment, who had said tomorrow and been told tonight and had, since that exchange, made no sound at all. And he thought of the note itself. The educated, precise hand, the stress visible in the pressure of the pen. And he thought of something that Mrs. Vane had said hours ago in this same restaurant car, like a cat at a mouse hole. Though who was the cat and who was the mouse, I could not entirely determine. "Doctor," said Poirot, and his voice had changed, not in volume, not in warmth, but in a quality beneath both that made Harriet Quine look at him with sudden and complete attention. "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to consider your answer with great care. Did you introduce the compound into Ashworth's drink?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The note, not what the note says, not what you intended, not what you have told yourself for the past 3 hours." His eyes were steady and direct, and entirely without judgment. "Did you, with your own hands, put the compound into Gerald Ashworth's whiskey glass?" The silence stretched. Through the window, a goods train passed on an adjacent track, its noise sudden and tremendous and brief, and then the quiet rushed back in. "No," said Harriet Quine, very quietly. No, I had the compound prepared. I had intended I was going to speak to him, confront him, and then— Yes, but he died before I— Someone else. She stopped. Someone else, said Poirot, got there first. He rose with the speed of a man who has been sitting on a very specific piece of information for several hours and has just received the final confirmation he required. He paused, only to remove the note from his breast pocket and place it on the shelf beside the half-full phial and the glass of water. You will stay here, he said, with a gentleness that was also entirely non-negotiable. You will not touch the phial. You will not go anywhere. I will send Constable Forbes to sit with you. Not as a guard, he added, but as company. Because I think, Dr. Quine, that you have been alone with this for long enough. He was in the corridor, moving before she could respond. The ventilation grate above compartment 9 was 4 steps from Dr. Quine's door. Poirot stopped beneath it. He reached up, just barely, on the tips of his patent leather shoes, and pressed the grate's lower edge. It swung inward with the frictionless ease of a thing that had been opened and closed recently, and repeatedly, by someone who knew exactly how to do it, without sound. The space behind the grate was a maintenance cavity, perhaps 8 inches deep, running between the ceiling panel and the carriage roof. In it, wedged against the far wall with the tidy efficiency of someone who had packed in a hurry, was a small cloth bag. Poirot did not remove the bag. He looked at it for 3 seconds, replaced the grate with great care, and stood in the corridor for a moment with his eyes closed and the expression of a man whose little grey cells have just completed a calculation of some complexity. Then he opened his eyes, smoothed his jacket, and went to find Inspector Glennie. Behind him, in compartment 9, Mr. Frederick Lowe, if that was his name, sat in perfect silence and listened to the footsteps of Hercule Poirot retreating down the corridor, and understood with the particular clarity of a person whose options have just been comprehensively and invisibly reduced to one, that the time for waiting was over. The cold cup of tea had been bothering Poirot since 2:43 in the morning. This was not, he would have been the first to acknowledge, a conventional foundation for the solution of a murder. Inspector Glennie, when Poirot had first drawn his attention to it, had looked at it with the expression of a man being asked to find significance in a piece of furniture, and had moved on to more immediately productive concerns. Constable Forbes had not looked at it at all. Mrs. Marsh, who had passed the attendant's station twice in the night, had mentioned it only as context, a detail in the background of what she was actually describing, the way a painting's frame is mentioned only in relation to the painting itself. But Poirot had looked at it. He had stopped for 3 seconds in front of Thomas Creel's abandoned station, with its folding chair and its cold cup of railway tea, and something about it had placed itself quietly at the back of his mind and declined to leave. It was still there at 11:40 when Mrs. Vane had brought him the note. It was still there at 12:05 when he had left Dr. Quine's compartment and stood beneath the ventilation grate. It was there now as he stood in the forward section of the first-class carriage outside the attendant's station and looked at the cup of tea one more time. The cup had been collected, of course, hours ago by a steward from the kitchen car, and the station was now empty and tidy, the folding chair unoccupied, the small shelf clear. There was nothing to see. Poirot looked at the nothing with great attention. The attendant, Thomas Creel, had emptied the corridor waste receptacles at 10:45 in the evening. He had then left his station to visit the young woman of his acquaintance in the third-class carriage, where he had remained until 1:40 in the morning. He had made himself a cup of tea upon his return, which placed the tea's preparation at approximately 1:45, and had then, presumably, sat down in his folding chair. But the chair had been empty at 2:23 when Mrs. Marsh had first passed it, and the tea had been cold, not merely cool. Cold. Cold enough that Mrs. Marsh, who had been looking for a hot water bottle and whose attention to matters of temperature was therefore professionally sharpened at that moment, had described it without qualification as cold. Not coolish or lukewarm, or not very warm, cold. Tea, in Poirot's domestic experience, became cold in approximately 40 minutes when left in a room of average temperature. A railway carriage corridor, with its drafts and its metal walls and its particular species of institutional chill, might reasonably accelerate this process to 35 minutes, perhaps on a cold October night, 30. Creel had made his tea at approximately 1:45. Mrs. Marsh had passed at 2:23, 38 minutes. The tea should have been cool, possibly quite cool, not cold, unless Creel had not made the tea at 1:45. Unless Creel had made the tea considerably earlier, had returned to his station considerably earlier than 1:40, had been sitting in his chair drinking his tea at some point that he had not disclosed during the window of time that was critical to everything. Poirot stood very still in the empty corridor. The attendant, he thought, saw something, or was seen by someone, and was then persuaded, frightened, paid, or both, to misremember the time of his return. This was the peace. The peace he had felt was missing since 3 o'clock in the morning, the peace that had been sitting in plain sight, in the form of a cup of cold tea, waiting with the patience of inanimate objects for someone to look at it correctly. He found Creel in the kitchen car, drying glasses with the mechanical dedication of a young man whose conscience has been troubling him for several hours and who has found, in repetitive physical task, a temporary and inadequate remedy. Poirot sat across from him at the small kitchen staff table and said nothing at all for a long moment, which was frequently more effective than saying something. Creel lasted 40 seconds. "I came back at 12:30. He said, without looking up from the glass he was drying. "Not 1:30, 12:30. "Yes," said Poirot. "I thought it might be something of that order. I made the tea straight off." Creel set the glass down. His hands, Poirot noted, were entirely steady, which argued either great self-possession or the specific steadiness of a young man who has rehearsed this moment. "I was sitting in the chair at 20:1, maybe a bit before. And at 20:1, or a bit before, what did you see?" A long pause. The kitchen car smelled of institutional coffee and metal and the particular olfactory memory of several hundred meals. "A door," said Creel. "Compartment 9. It opened about halfway, and a hand came out. Just a hand, I couldn't see the person, and put something in the waste receptacle." He paused, the one that I'd already emptied, at 11:15. "A small glass vial," said Poirot. Creel looked at him for the first time. "You know, I know. Continue, if you please." The door closed again. "Quick and quiet. Not slammed, just—" He made a small, definitive gesture with the glass cloth. "Done. And then about, 5 minutes maybe, the door opened again, the same door, and the same hand, or I thought it was, put something else in the receptacle, something small, I couldn't see what, and then the door closed and didn't open again." 2 deposits, thought Poirot. 2 separate visits to the waste receptacle, 5 minutes apart, the file on the first visit. Something else on the second. Something else, which the police had not found, because they had found the file and stopped looking. "You said nothing to Inspector Glennie about this?" said Poirot. "There was a man," said Creel, with the flat simplicity of someone describing an unpleasant but uncomplicated fact. "When I went back to my station after making the tea, he was in the corridor, said he'd been to the bathroom, was going back to his compartment. We stood there a minute. He was very calm about it, very ordinary. But before he went, he said—" A pause. "He said he'd noticed I'd been away from my station most of the night, said it would be a shame if the railway company heard about it. Said he was sure if everyone just went about their business sensibly, there was no reason for anyone to make trouble for anyone else." Creel looked at his glass cloth. He had a way of saying it, not threatening exactly, just certain. "And the man," said Poirot carefully. "Which compartment did he go back to?" 9, said Creel. "Compartment 9. Poirot walked back through the kitchen car, through the second-class dining section, through the corridor that connected the restaurant car to the first-class sleeper carriage, and he walked it at his own pace, which was slow because he was thinking with the entire assembled force of what he sometimes, privately and without false modesty, called his little grey cells. The shape of it was there now. The full, complete, devastating shape of it, visible in the way that a landscape becomes visible when the morning mist clears, not all at once, but in a progressive revelation that arrives finally, at a totality. He saw the cufflink, not as accident or planted evidence, but as exactly what it was. Something lost, something dropped in haste, in the dark, by someone who had not been Gerald Ashworth but had been in Ashworth's compartment in the moments before or after his death. Someone who had been there not to kill, but for another purpose entirely. Someone who had found what they came for and left, and had not realized, until they were back in their own compartment, what they had left behind. He saw the clean glass, not the work of the murderer covering their tracks, but the work of someone else entirely. Someone who had come into the compartment after the murder was done, and had found the glass and had understood with professional and personal precision exactly what it meant, and had cleaned it, not to protect themselves, but to protect another person. An act of love, or something close enough to love to be indistinguishable from it in the dark. He saw the note. The cufflink is under the bed. I put it there. A lie, included in a confession. A lie told by a woman of extraordinary intelligence and precision, which could only mean one thing: that the lie was intended to protect someone, and that the someone it was intended to protect was the person who had actually lost the cufflink. He saw Frederick Lowe in his compartment, who had come on this train with a purpose and a false name, and who had hidden something in the ventilation cavity above his own compartment, not the tools of a crime, but the tools of an investigation. An investigator's tools. He stopped walking. In the corridor of the first-class sleeper carriage, equidistant between the restaurant car behind him and the compartments ahead, Hercule Poirot stood quite still and allowed the final piece to arrive, which it did, with the quiet, unspectacular certainty of something that has always been true waiting to be acknowledged. The cufflinks, gold, octagonal, dark blue enamel centers. The surviving cufflink, still in Ashworth's right cuff. He had seen it. He had noted it. He had filed it with precision in the cabinet of his mind, and had not, until this moment, taken it out and looked at it in the context of everything else. Gerald Ashworth had been lying fully dressed on his berth. His tie had been loosened, by exactly the degree that suggested deliberate adjustment, not his own adjustment. Someone else's adjustment, after death, a small, careful staging intended to suggest a man who had simply lain down, loosened his tie, and died in his sleep. A man who had simply lain down, did not arrange his hands at his sides. A man who had simply lain down, had not had his cufflink removed and then replaced. Only one of the pair found under the bed because the other was dropped in the dark during a hasty repositioning of the body's right arm. The body had been moved, after death, not before, turned or shifted, and then arranged, and in the arrangement, a cufflink had been dislodged and lost, and not found in the dark, and left. He saw now who had moved it, and why, and in the seeing of this, every other fact in the case aligned around it with the mathematical elegance of a proof completing itself. "Ah," said Hercule Poirot, very quietly, in the empty corridor, with no audience but the walls and the morning light coming through the end window and the distant receding hills of Cumbria. Just, the sound of a man arriving, after a very long walk, at exactly where he had been going. He straightened his cuffs. He checked the alignment of his moustaches with one brief, habitual touch. He looked, for a moment, at the door of compartment 9, which was closed, and at the ventilation grate above it, which gave nothing away. Then he walked to compartment 8 and knocked on the Colonel's door and said through it, "Colonel Fawkes, I wonder if you would do me the very great kindness of asking everyone to assemble in the restaurant car at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Everyone who was present last night." A pause. "Yes, including Mr. Lowe. Please tell him specifically that I said, 'It is time.'" He did not wait for the Colonel's response. He had, for the first time since 2:43 in the morning, nothing further to discover. Everything he needed was already in his possession. It had been in his possession, in one form or another, since he had stood in the doorway of compartment 7 at 4 o'clock in the morning and looked at a dead man and a clean glass and a not quite latched window and a fallen cufflink, and had felt, in the precise and silent machinery of his mind, the very first, small, definitive click. There would be, now, simply the explaining of it, the gathering, the theatre of revelation, which he neither enjoyed nor apologized for, because it was not theatre for its own sake, but theatre in the service of truth, a truth that would hurt several people, free one, and leave at least one other standing in the rubble of something that had seemed, for 31 years, like justice, but had turned out to be something considerably more complicated. He went to his compartment. He sat down. He closed his eyes. And, for exactly 22 minutes, in the way of a man who has learned to rest completely when rest is available, Hercule Poirot slept. They came at 2 o'clock, as requested. They came with the reluctant, collective obedience of people who have spent a morning in the company of their own thoughts, and have found that company, on the whole, unrewarding. They came separately, no two of them entering the restaurant car together, as though each had independently determined that proximity to the others was a thing to be delayed until absolutely necessary. They sat, by some unspoken arrangement, at the same positions they had occupied that morning. Miss Cartwright with her untouched tea, the Colonel with his broad hands flat upon the table, Mrs. Vane with her amber beads and her sketchbook closed for once, Dr. Quine with her careful, clinical stillness, Peter Ashworth at the far end with his scoured, sleepless face. Mr. Frederick Lowe arrived last, which was noted by everyone, and sat at a table slightly apart from the others, which was noted by Poirot. Inspector Glennie stood to one side with Constable Forbes in the attitude of a man who has been persuaded, against his better professional judgment, to cede the floor to a civilian, and who intends to demonstrate by his posture that this concession is temporary and conditional. The Caledonian Night Express had, at last, been permitted to proceed. They were moving again, had been moving for 40 minutes. The Scottish border behind them now, the landscape outside the windows shifting from the high drama of the Cumbrian fells to the broader, more austere beauty of the southern uplands. Edinburgh was 2 hours distant. The rhythm of the rails was back, that steady, almost hypnotic percussion that had been the soundtrack to the night's events. And it provided, Poirot thought, an oddly appropriate accompaniment to what was about to occur. He stood at the front of the restaurant car, a small cup of coffee before him on the nearest table, and he looked at the assembled company for a long moment, without speaking. The silence did its work. "I want to begin," said Poirot, in the pleasant conversational tone he used when he intended to say something that was not pleasant at all, "with a cup of tea." Several faces registered the particular confusion of people who have been bracing for a blow and received instead a non sequitur. "Specifically," he continued, "the cup of tea made by Mr. Thomas Creel, the carriage attendant, at approximately 20 minutes to 1 this morning. A cup of tea which was cold, observably, definitively cold, when Mrs. Marsh passed the attendant's station at 23 minutes past 2. This small domestic detail is where I wish to begin, because it is where the truth begins, not with the body, not with the poison, not with the confession." A brief pause, and Dr. Quine's eyes met his and held, but with a cold cup of tea which told me that Mr. Creel had returned to his station earlier than he admitted and had witnessed something he was subsequently persuaded to forget. He moved slightly, adjusting his position, and the movement had the quality of a stage direction, a deliberate realignment that caused every eye in the room to follow him. "But I will not begin at the beginning," he said. "We have not the time, and besides, it is not the most interesting place to start. I will begin, instead, with what did not happen last night." He looked at Peter Ashworth. Mr. Peter Ashworth did not kill his father. The young man's jaw tightened imperceptibly, not with relief, Poirot noted, but with the specific, exhausted gratitude of someone who has been holding a weight and has had it acknowledged. The case against him was, on its surface, compelling. Motive, the revised will, the disinheritance, opportunity. The last confirmed person to speak with the deceased. Proximity, His compartment 3 doors from his father's, and the argument in the corridor, witnessed and reported. Poirot inclined his head. What the case against him did not account for was the nature of that argument. Peter Ashworth told his father at 11:15 last night that he intended to make a legal statement about the death of Julian Vane in Switzerland in 1955. He was not threatening his father for money or for the will or for any personal advantage. He was, after 3 years of silence, doing the thing that frightened him most and that he believed to be right. A pause. A man who has finally found the courage to do the right thing does not, 1 hour later, commit murder. The psychological architecture is entirely wrong. Colonel Fawkes shifted in his seat. Poirot turned to him. The Colonel I eliminate on different grounds. Colonel Fawkes needed Ashworth alive. The documents in his attaché case, which represent a shared financial liability of considerable magnitude, required Ashworth's signature and cooperation to resolve. A man who kills his only means of salvation is not a murderer. He is merely desperate. He met the Colonel's eyes briefly. And we will speak of those documents with the appropriate authorities in Edinburgh, mon ami, where I trust a resolution may yet be found. But murder? No, not the Colonel. Fawkes exhaled with the slow, complete deflation of a man releasing something he has held tightly for a very long time. Poirot turned to Mrs. Vane. Mrs. Theodora Vane I eliminate with the simplest arithmetic. She had motive, 31 years of it. An old and legitimate grief, a son whose death she has never ceased to attribute, correctly, to Gerald Ashworth. But motive alone is not method, and Mrs. Vane had neither the pharmacological knowledge nor the opportunity to introduce a compound into Ashworth's drink. She spent the evening at her table in the restaurant car, drawing. She spoke to no one except when spoken to. She went to her compartment at 10:30 and did not, as far as all evidence suggests, leave it again until this morning. He paused. What Mrs. Vane did have was the most accurate pair of eyes in this carriage. She observed, and told me, without knowing the significance of what she said, that Miss Cartwright watched Ashworth all evening like a cat at a mouse-hole, and that she could not determine which was the cat and which was the mouse. He looked at Mrs. Vane gently. It was an excellent observation. It contained, as it happens, the entire solution, though neither of us knew it at the time. Mrs. Vane's amber beads shifted as she straightened almost imperceptibly. There was something in her eyes that was not quite grief and not quite vindication, but occupied the difficult territory between them. Poirot's gaze moved to Miss Cartwright. "Mademoiselle Cartwright," he said, and his voice was careful. "I do not eliminate, but I also do not accuse. What I do is explain." She was very still. The composed, calibrated mask was in place, but behind it, something had changed. A fundamental change, like a building whose internal structure has altered while the facade remains intact. You were being blackmailed by Gerald Ashworth. A letter. Personal, ill-considered, written in a moment of vulnerability, which he had used to pressure you into facilitating document fraud on his behalf. Last night he came to your table and delivered what amounted to a final ultimatum. Poirot paused. After dinner, you went to his compartment. Not to kill him. You had no means to kill him, no pharmacological knowledge, no access to such a compound. You went to retrieve the letter, which he had in his breast pocket. You had seen it there, earlier in the evening, when his jacket was open in the restaurant car. Miss Cartwright's hands, folded in her lap, pressed together slightly. He was already dead when you arrived. You entered. The door was not quite latched, as we know, and you found him as Mrs. Marsh would find him, less than 2 hours later, and you understood, with the quick, practical intelligence that is your genuine character beneath the composure, that a young woman found in the room of a dead man, removing an object from his pocket, would be in a position of extraordinary difficulty. Poirot's voice remained entirely without judgment. So you took the letter, and in taking it, in the dark, in haste, you dislodged one of his cufflinks without realizing it. And then you saw the glass with its residue, and you understood, because you are intelligent, what had happened, and you cleaned it. Not to protect yourself, but because the state of the glass, if found by the police, would expose something you had no wish to expose. He paused. Someone who had been kind to you. Someone for whom you had developed during this journey a regard that surprised you. He turned now to Dr. Harriet Quine. The doctor met his eyes. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has expected this and has not, in the end, run from it. Dr. Quine, said Poirot, prepared the means. She had the knowledge, the compound, the understanding of Ashworth's precise medical vulnerability. She had, over a period of 2 years, moved from intellectual preparation to practical preparation, which is a significant and terrible journey, and one she travelled alone, for 31 years of grief. He was quiet for a moment. She intended to act. She had intended it since she boarded this train, and then she did not act, because someone else did first. The restaurant car was entirely silent now. Even the rhythm of the rails seemed to have quietened, though this was, Poirot knew, a psychological effect of total attention. She found the glass sometime after midnight. We will establish the precise time with Mr. Creel's assistance, and she understood it immediately. And she cleaned it, as I have described. And she returned to her compartment and wrote a confession that contained one deliberate lie, that she had placed the cufflink under the bed in order to absorb suspicion into herself and away from Miss Cartwright, whose presence in the compartment she had deduced. He paused. This is not the action of a murderer protecting herself. This is the action of a woman who has carried guilt for 31 years and found, when the moment of release arrived, that she could not quite accept it on someone else's terms. Dr. Quine looked at the table before her. One hand had closed around the coffee cup, and the knuckle was white. Dr. Quine did not kill Gerald Ashworth, said Poirot. She was prepared to. She was perhaps one decision away from doing so, but she did not. He turned, finally, with the slow deliberateness of inevitability itself, toward the table where Mr. Frederick Lowe sat alone. The killer is here. The man who was not named Frederick Lowe did not move. He did not look up. He sat with a quality of stillness that was entirely unlike the stillness of the innocent, which is the stillness of people who are waiting to be released, and entirely unlike the stillness of the guilty, which is the stillness of people who are waiting to be caught. It was a third kind of stillness, altogether more considered, the stillness of a man who has known this moment was coming and has decided in advance exactly how he will meet it. Your name, said Poirot, is not Frederick Lowe. You are not an accountant. You have not, so far as I can establish, ever worked for Meridian Financial Associates in George Street, Edinburgh, which is a firm I confess I invented on the spot during our interview, and which you confirmed with a speed that indicated you were providing a prepared answer rather than a true one. Something changed in the man's face. A microsecond of reaction, quickly managed, quickly contained. You are, said Poirot, a private inquiry agent. You have been investigating Gerald Ashworth on behalf of a client for a period of some months. The bag in the ventilation cavity above your compartment contains a camera, a notebook, and a collection of documents relating to Ashworth's financial and personal history. Documents which, taken together, constitute what I believe the legal profession calls a brief. He paused. Your client wished to build a case against Ashworth, not for the police necessarily, but for use in a civil proceeding or as personal leverage, or simply as the documentation of truth. People commission such investigations for many reasons. Poirot looked at him steadily. You came on this train because Ashworth was on this train, and because you had recently acquired information suggesting that he was about to do something, transfer assets, destroy documents, reach Edinburgh, and take an action that would have rendered your investigation incomplete or your client's position compromised. He paused. You had followed Ashworth for months. You knew his habits, his associates, his medical condition. And you discovered, on this train, that you were not the only person with a reason to wish Gerald Ashworth's activities permanently halted. The man looked up then. His face was calm and entirely readable, which was, Poirot reflected, the most dangerous kind of face. You found, said Poirot softly, That someone had done what you, in all your months of careful investigation, had not permitted yourself to do. And you saw, with the particular professional clarity of a man trained to see things quickly and act on what he sees, an opportunity not to escape justice but to arrange it, quietly, efficiently, with the minimum of disruption to yourself and the maximum of consequence to the dead. He let the silence hold. "You killed Gerald Ashworth," said Poirot, "and then you placed the file in the waste receptacle twice because you were interrupted the first time by a sound in the corridor, went back inside, waited, and then completed the disposal, and you returned to your compartment. And you waited, with the patience of a professional, to see what the morning would bring." The man, who was not Frederick Lowe, looked at Hercule Poirot for a long moment, across the length of the restaurant car, with the expression of one craftsman assessing another's work. "You're right about almost everything," he said. His voice was quiet and educated, and entirely without drama. "Almost." "Yes," said Poirot. "I know which part I have wrong. You will tell me now, and then Inspector Glennie will take over, and the matter will proceed as it must." He tilted his head slightly. "The almost, it concerns the motive, does it not? Not what you did, but why. The why is rather different from what it appears." The man was quiet for 3 seconds. "My client," he said, "is sitting in this room." Every head turned. Every face reconfigured in the sudden, vertiginous shift of a new reality arriving. Poirot did not turn. He watched the man who was not Frederick Lowe, and he nodded very slightly, as though this confirmed rather than surprised him. "Yes," said Poirot. "I know." The amber beads did not move. The sketchbook did not move. The tall, angular woman in the plum traveling suit sat with the composed, absolute stillness of someone who has spent 31 years preparing for a moment and finds, now that it has arrived, that preparation and experience are not quite the same thing. "No," she said. Not a denial, a correction. "I commissioned the documentation. There is a difference, Monsieur Poirot." "There is," said Poirot. "And it is a difference that matters enormously, so we will be very precise about it." He moved to stand nearer the center of the room, equidistant from everyone, and when he spoke again, his voice had the quality it took on when he was being most serious. Quieter, not louder, stripped of pleasantry, as precise as the point of a surgical instrument. "Mrs. Vane engaged this man, whose name, Inspector Glennie, is James Calvert, licensed inquiry agent, formerly of the Metropolitan Police, approximately 8 months ago. She had, by means I will not speculate upon, become aware of Ashworth's heart condition and his medication. She had learned of it and had thought about it, as people think about the deaths of those who have destroyed something irreplaceable with a cold and private consideration. But she did not commission a murder. She commissioned a file." He looked at Calvert, who was watching him with the professional attention of a man recalibrating in real time. "A file," Poirot continued, "documenting everything that could be documented about Gerald Ashworth's business activities, his financial maneuvers, his history, including, Mr. Calvert found, several things that were rather more recent and rather more actionable than a 31-year-old death in the Alps." He paused. "Specifically, the blackmail of Miss Cartwright, which left a documentary trail. The fraudulent manipulation of the investment documents belonging to Colonel Fawkes, which left a rather larger one. And a third matter. The most recent, the most urgent, the one that made Ashworth's journey to Edinburgh not a pleasure trip, but a necessity, which concerned a transaction he intended to complete on Friday morning with a property developer in Edinburgh's new town, a transaction that would, once completed, render a very considerable sum of money entirely untraceable and entirely beyond the reach of 3 separate civil claims currently being prepared against him." Colonel Fawkes made a sound. Miss Cartwright closed her eyes briefly. Peter Ashworth looked at the table. "Calvert had the file," said Poirot. It was, by any measure, a formidable piece of work. 8 months of careful, professional investigation, assembled with the rigor of a man trained by the Metropolitan Police and sharpened by 15 years of private practice. Mrs. Vane had paid for the truth, and she had received it. He looked at the woman in the plum suit. What she intended to do with it, I believe, was lay it before a solicitor in Edinburgh. On Friday morning, before Ashworth could complete his transaction, before the money disappeared, before the trail went cold, a civil action, a public exposure, justice conducted through legitimate channels, 31 years late. Mrs. Vane looked at him steadily. "That is correct," she said. "And then," said Poirot, "something changed." He turned back to Calvert. "You had been on this train since Euston, watching. You watched Ashworth at dinner. You watched him visit Miss Cartwright's table and deliver his ultimatum. You were close enough, I think, to hear some portion of it or to understand its nature from what you had already documented. And you watched, from the corridor, through a gap in the restaurant car door, the exchange between Peter Ashworth and his father. You could not hear the words, but you had been following Gerald Ashworth for 8 months, and you had learned to read him. You saw the son deliver something that hit its target, and you saw Ashworth leave the restaurant car at what time, precisely? 11:03, said Calvert. The precision of a man for whom time is professional currency. 11:03, and you followed him at a distance, because you were thorough, because it was your habit, because 8 months of investigation does not end at the dinner table. Poirot's voice was entirely level. And you saw something in the corridor, or heard something through a door, that changed your assessment of the situation. Calvert looked at him. The professional calm was intact, but beneath it something had shifted. Not guilt, precisely, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who has been correctly read, and finds, in being correctly read, a species of relief. "He went to his compartment," said Calvert. "And I heard him. He was on the telephone, the train telephone, in the compartment. He spoke for approximately 6 minutes. A pause. He was speaking to his solicitor in Edinburgh, Fenwick. James Fenwick, of Fenwick and Greer, in Charlotte Square. He was restructuring, moving things. The Friday transaction, the one Mrs. Vane's file documented. He'd heard something, suspected something, I don't know what, but he was pulling it forward. Completing it by telephone, that night, in a way that a man like Fenwick apparently had the means to facilitate for a client of Ashworth's standing. The professional voice did not change. By morning, the money would be gone. By morning, the file was worth considerably less than it had been worth at dinner. The restaurant car absorbed this with the quality of a room in which everyone is thinking very quickly. "So," said Poirot, 8 months of work, 3 civil claims, including one on behalf of the woman who had paid for all of it, about to be rendered worthless in a single telephone call. He paused. "And you had, in your medical kit, because a careful field investigator carries many things, and because you had made it your business, working this particular case, to understand the pharmacological dimensions of Ashworth's condition, you had the means." "I had researched it," said Calvert, "as part of the investigation. What compounds interacted with his medication. Academic research, the same research Dr. Quine has published partially in conference papers. It wasn't difficult to find." He did not look at Dr. Quine. "I had a compound. I carried it because I told myself it was documentation. Proof that such a thing was possible. I had not decided to use it." "Until you heard the telephone call," said Poirot. "Until I heard the telephone call. The simplicity of it was the most terrible thing about it. Not passion, not hatred, not the long-simmering fury of personal injury. A calculation. A professional assessment of means, opportunity, and the expiration of all other options. Poirot had seen crimes committed from love, from fear, from desperation, from madness. He had not often seen a crime committed with quite this quality of cold, exhausted pragmatism, the crime of a man who has spent 8 months accumulating justice and watched it dissolve in 6 minutes on a train telephone, and made, in the subsequent silence, a decision that he had not, perhaps, entirely made. "You waited," said Poirot, "until Ashworth had settled, until the corridor was quiet, and then you went to him. Knock on the door, a professional pretext, a face he did not know and therefore did not fear. The drink was already poured. Ashworth, we know, kept whiskey in his compartment. It was the work of a moment. He let me in," said Calvert. "He was calm. He thought I was from the railway company. I said there was a query about his reservation. He poured himself a drink while I talked. He was very relaxed. The voice remained steady. He offered me one. I declined. The detail landed in the room with disproportionate weight, the civility of it. The ordinary social gesture, a man offering a drink to a stranger who was about to kill him, in a small mahogany compartment, rolling through the English dark towards Scotland. I put it in the glass while his back was turned, said Calvert. He went to get his ticket from his jacket on the hook. 4 seconds. He looked at his hands for a moment. The first personal gesture he had made. 4 seconds. Poirot was quiet. Around the room, the assembled passengers were quiet. Outside, the Scottish landscape moved in the afternoon light, its long, grey-green hills rolling away in every direction, with the magnificent indifference of things that have been here much longer than the human compulsion to destroy each other. He drank it, said Calvert. We talked for another few minutes. I left. He was alive when I left, for a while. And then, said Poirot, you went to the waste receptacle, and then you returned to your compartment, and, some time later, you heard Miss Cartwright in the corridor. She is not, despite her elegance, entirely silent in the dark, and you waited, and then you deposited the file a second time, and you encountered Thomas Creel, and you managed him with the efficiency of someone trained in the management of inconvenient witnesses. He paused. And then you waited for morning? Calvert looked at him. Yes, he said. That is what I did. The word yes in the restaurant car of the Caledonian Night Express at 2:47 in the afternoon, 11 years' worth of miles from where it had all begun. Inspector Glennie moved forward. Calvert did not resist. Did not move at all, in fact, until Forbes had reached him, and then he rose with the orderly compliance of a man who had known this was where the corridor led, and had chosen to walk it to its end rather than turn back. Poirot watched this with an expression that those who knew him well would have recognized. It was not satisfaction. It was not triumph. It was the expression of a man looking at the full, completed shape of a human catastrophe, at all its causes, its compounded griefs, its decades of accumulated wrong, the 31-year chain of consequence that had led from a mountainside in Switzerland to a mahogany sleeper compartment on a train in the dark, and finding it, as he always found it, both entirely comprehensible and entirely heartbreaking. He turned to look at Mrs. Vane. She was looking not at Calvert, not at Inspector Glennie, not at Forbes and the formal, careful machinery of arrest that was unfolding at the far end of the restaurant car. She was looking out the window, at the hills, and her face had in it the expression of a woman who has received something she asked for and finds that receiving it is not the same as being healed by it. Poirot did not speak to her then. There would be time for that. He turned to Peter Ashworth, who was looking at the table with his eyes very bright, and said very quietly, "Your father did a terrible thing to Julian Vane, and he did many terrible things to many people over many years. These things are true, and they are not erased by his death." A pause. "But you are not your father's crimes. You are, I think, the thing that opposed them. And the statement you were going to make in Edinburgh, you will still make it. The file that Mr. Calvert assembled contains documentation that will assist you. Inspector Glennie will ensure it is preserved." Peter Ashworth looked up. He did not speak, but something in his face moved, shifted, in the way that faces shift when a burden, not removed, is at least acknowledged by another person's recognition of its weight. Poirot straightened his cuffs. He looked around the restaurant car one final time, at Miss Cartwright, who was holding a retrieved letter in her lap and would spend some weeks deciding what to do with the freedom it represented, at Colonel Fawkes, whose financial difficulties were not resolved but were now, at least, visible in daylight where they might be addressed, at Mrs. Vane, who was still looking at the hills, at Peter Ashworth, at Dr. Quine, who sat with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on the middle distance, and the long, slow work of 31 years of unexpressed grief, beginning, perhaps, its first tentative exhalation. He thought of a cold cup of tea. He thought of a clean glass. He thought of one gold cufflink catching the amber light of a small bedside lamp. "Bien," said Hercule Poirot, to no one in particular. "It is done."